In the course of my Production Hell series, I've covered all manner of cinematic calamities. Some managed to pull spectacular movies from the most nightmarish production experiences imaginable, some started out on shaky ground before descending into complete farce and madness, and others somehow managed to fritter away tens of millions of dollars without shooting a single frame. But this next one is kind of unique in the world of failed Hollywood projects. There were no major disasters or mistakes during production, the cast and crew all got along pretty well, the studio didn't interfere too much, the film was delivered on time and on budget, and the whole project progressed smoothly all the way to the first test screening. Then, just like that, the film got cancelled without warning, deleted from the studio's servers, and to this day, it remains locked away deep in a studio vault, a sad relic of an aborted idea, destined never to be shared with the worlds. I'm talking, of course, about the infamous Batgirl. Now, normally when it comes to these kind of videos, there's a wealth of production information, interviews and reference material for me to draw on, but in this case, actual details of what happened to Batgirl are pretty thin on the grounds. Almost intentionally so, you might say. There's plenty of rumours and hearsay, but not much else, and I think it's about time that changed. So my main goal with this video is to provide as accurate a picture I can of how this movie came together and how it ultimately fell apart. To do this, I was able to interview multiple people involved with the production at various levels who agreed to speak to me on condition of anonymity, and after spending quite a bit of time collating their various recollections of the project, cross-referencing it against the limited information that's publicly available, I've managed to assemble what I consider a pretty accurate history of the making and breaking of Batgirl. And as far as I know, some of the stuff I'm about to tell you has never been shared publicly. So suit up and get ready, because we're venturing deep into the darkness for this one. The idea for a solo Batgirl movie began life back in 2017 when Warner became interested in working the character of Barbara Gordon into the DCEU. The original idea was to include her in Harley Quinn's Birds of Prey movie, but it was soon obvious that she didn't really fit with the tone of the film, so she was moved into her own solo movie instead. Joss Whedon was initially hired to write, direct and produce the film with the plan to start production in 2018. The project never really came to much though, partly because Whedon struggled to come up with decent story ideas, partly because his work on Justice League hadn't done much for his reputation at Warner, and partly because of a change of leadership at the studio. Walter Hamada was now the CEO, and he had his own ideas about how the franchise should move forwards. And keep that in mind, dear viewer, because it'll be important later. Anyway, Hamada was faced with the daunting task of trying to fix a DCEU that was already going off the rails at a rapid pace. Zack Snyder's creative vision hadn't worked out, and the question now was what to replace it with. Part of Hamada's plan to revamp DC was an increased focus on female characters like Harley Quinn, Supergirl, Batgirl and Wonder Woman, because that kind of thing was very much on trend for obvious reasons. With this in mind, Christina Hodson, best known for writing Birds of Prey, was brought in to write a new script for Batgirl. The film was intended as a response to the overblown excesses of Batman vs Superman and Justice League, hopefully proving the point that comic book movies didn't have to cost hundreds of millions of dollars and rely on CGI spectacle to sell themselves. The intention was to tell a more grounded, gritty, character-focused story that centred around Barbara Gordon's search for the man who killed her mother in an arson attack 15 years earlier. The man in question would turn out to be Firefly, a former firefighter named Ted Carson working for the mob, who intentionally burned down buildings to clear out areas for redevelopment, allowing his bosses to collect the insurance money and become insanely rich in the process. In the years since then, mob boss Anthony Bresci has used the profits to become a legit businessman and a pillar of Gotham society. Carson, meanwhile, has struggled to hold down a job as his past trauma keeps coming back to haunt him, and with his wife now terminally ill and medical bills mounting up, he begins to slip back into his old profession. As Barbara starts investigating the new spree of arson attacks, she ends up teaming up with Michael Keaton's Batman, who also has an interest in stopping Firefly and exposing Bresci's corrupt past, and ultimately becomes a kind of mentor for her. By 2020, the script was finished and Batgirl officially went into production alongside The Flash, which was intended to come out first and introduce the idea of alternate timelines that would help explain Keaton's presence in the movie. The directing team team of Adil and Bilal were brought in to oversee the film in May 2021. The two men had successfully brought the Bad Boys franchise out of hibernation the previous year, and they were familiar with superhero projects after working on Ms. Marvel, so they seemed like a safe pair of hands in this case. Brendan Fraser, who was in the middle of a career resurgence at the time, was soon locked in as Firefly, J.K. Simmons as Commissioner Gordon, and of course Michael Keaton as Bruce Wayne. Oh, and as a little side note, when Walter Hamada was asked why Keaton's Batman was in this movie instead of the Ben Affleck version, but J.K. Simmons was still playing Commissioner Gordon like in Justice League, his answer was, "Nah, it's all just spaghetti, man."
Yes, I can definitely smell shite.
Fucking spaghetti. Anyway, the problem now was finding a Batgirl for the movie. The production team tested up to 500 different actresses of various ages and ethnicities for the role. Their directive was that nothing was off the table, anyone would be considered. And gradually the hopefuls were whittled down to two main contenders, Zoe Deutsch and Leslie Grace, with Grace ultimately impressing the team and bagging the role. What they hadn't really counted on though was the fan reaction. See, Barbara Gordon from the comics was a redhead, while Leslie Grace was Dominican, and straight away the online reactions were explosive. Race swapping was becoming a real hot topic issue in comic book fandoms, and Batgirl had unexpectedly wandered into a firestorm of controversy. Not exactly a great start, but the team were still confident that Grace's performance would eventually win most of them over. And meanwhile, there were other problems to deal with. The script by Christina Hodson was generally seen as decent in concept, but rough and unfinished in execution, with plot holes that needed patching and character motivations that didn't always make sense. What it really needed was some serious polishing up, and when Adil and Bilal went to the studio with some suggestions a few months before shooting, they were given a simple ultimatum in return. If you guys want to make a different movie, then fuck it, we'll just pull the plug on the entire project.
Boy, that escalated quickly.
Now, this might seem like a bit of an overreaction, but in a wider context, it wasn't entirely unjustified. See, the studio had had a bit of a nightmare with their recent adaptation of Stephen King's It, where Cary Fukunaga had tried to rewrite half the script just weeks before production, forcing them to replace him with Andy Muschietti, and a similar situation was currently going on with the troubled Flash movie. The last thing they needed was another production going off the rails because the directors decided to go rogue. Since it was pretty obvious that Warner Brothers weren't going to play ball, the two of them were left with no choice but to shoot the script exactly as it was written, warts and all. Their assumption was that the problems would become obvious to the studio in test screenings, freeing them up to make the required changes in reshoots. Not exactly the most efficient way of doing things on a movie with a tight budget, but it was the only way forwards. But as it turned out, fate would take them on a very different path. Anyway, principal photography began in Glasgow in November 2021, and apart from a temporary shutdown due to COVID, the shoot went pretty smoothly. By all accounts, cast and crew got along well together, Leslie Grace was perfectly fine in the role, there were no major problems or disasters, and the studio were happy with the film's progress. Filming wrapped in March 2022, and the project moved into post-production. And this is where the real problems began. The first issue was money, which was mysteriously drying up at an alarming rate. Various special effects shots were still unfinished, and there was no word on how or when the funds would be freed up to complete them. The studio also started issuing weird and contradictory directives, like the movie had to be lighter and more fun, when the whole point of the project was to make a film that was dark, grounded and serious. It was a bit fucking late to change your minds about the whole tone of the movie, guys. And to make matters worse, The Flash was now delayed for the first of several big reshoots. Keep in mind that The Flash had to come out before Batgirl, otherwise the story wouldn't make sense. Then the first test screening happened, using a rough cut of the movie with unfinished effects. Now, you've probably heard rumours of that screening being an unmitigated disaster that horrified studio executives so badly that they nuked the entire project almost overnight. Shit, man, I mean, how bad could this thing possibly be? Well, as it turns out, that's all kind of bullshit. In reality, the film got a mediocre 61% from test audiences. Now, that doesn't sound particularly good, because it isn't, but to put it into some kind of context, Birds of Prey's first rough cut got a score in the high 30s, while Top Gun Maverick was in the mid 80s. So it turned out Batgirl was about midway between the two extremes. Not a great film by any stretch, but not a total disaster either, and definitely salvageable with re-edits and reshoots. This is the point where the directors expected the studio to finally greenlight the changes they'd originally requested, because the need for them was now playing plainly obvious. Unfortunately for them, much bigger changes were now afoot at Warner. The revolving door of senior executives had just swung around again. Walter Hamada was out and David Zaslav was in. Zaslav had a reputation as a hard-nosed businessman, willing to make tough calls to get struggling studios back on track, and well, he certainly didn't disappoint in this case. His assessment of DC on film was that it was a complete clusterfuck, the Snyderverse was a total failure, and a hard reset was the only way to put things right. Aquaman 2, The Flash, and Blue Beetle were either too far along or too expensive to cancel, and weirdly, The Flash was consistently testing well for some reason, but everything else that could possibly be cancelled was shut down immediately and written off as tax breaks, including Batgirl. The announcement of the film's cancellation came in August 2022, surprising the production team just as much as the rest of us. From what I've been told, there was no warning from the studio before the official announcement went out, mainly to make sure that none of the crew managed to save a copy of the film that might accidentally leak online later. The servers were scrubbed overnight and all remaining footage was purged, like it never even existed in the first place. Damn man, Joseph Stalin couldn't have erased history as effectively as these guys. And that was pretty much the end of the saga of Batgirl, the movie that never was. And aside from a few production stills and some behind the scenes videos, we'll probably never get to see what this movie could have been. The only copies are now literally under lock and key in the Warner Brothers vault, and releasing the film would mean repaying the tax write-off they claimed when it was cancelled, so I don't imagine it'll ever see the light of day at this point. And in some ways, it's kind of a shame, because not only did it sound like a fairly interesting story that would have seen Michael Keaton actually get to play Batman instead of fighting space aliens in a fucking desert, but it also sucks for all the people who worked so hard on it. It's one thing to get slated for releasing a shitty film, but it's another thing to take the blame for a movie that nobody even got to see. And when I think about all the reasons why this film fell apart, it really seems more like a collection of what-ifs rather than one particular person or decision being to blame. What if Walter Hamada had been more receptive to the script revisions before shooting began? What if the team had had more time to edit the movie before that first test screening? What if the leadership at Warner hadn't changed at such a crucial moment? What if David Zaslav had chosen to cancel Blue Beetle or Aquaman 2 instead? What if the team had had time to salvage a cut of the film before it was wiped? We'll never really know, I guess. But whatever its strengths or shortcomings, I think Batgirl stands as a prime example of the wrong film in the wrong place at the wrong time. Just another casualty of studio politics and shifting strategies. Another sad reminder of what might have been. Anyway, that's all I've got for today. Go away now.